Righty. Okay. Welcome to This and That, 3rd of October. Jesus. Um, we're at the last chapter. I skipped ahead. I I did do the prior 10 chapters, but I decided I didn't want to talk about Europe so much. That's being, you know, Americentric, I suppose. So we're in chapter 29 of Michael Hudson's book, and it summarizes everything. By the time you get to the end, some of us become not so much adherents or converts to modern money theory, but at least in principle, I can see all this happening. And that's because I'm probably too naive or still too idealistic. I can see it all happening. And maybe that's dangerous, but I think I'm going to send a copy to my Congress credit and say, listen, you or at least your staff should read this and think about it anyway. And of course, then I will make some other sub questions that, there are a couple of folks who believe in this shit who are who are also in the Congress, some, or not the Congress, but in the administration. So I should get on to this. Although I do want an opinion, and I think I don't have that, and I should search for how Bernie Sanders thinks about how he thinks about it. And I'm sure he's in favor of it, but we haven't. I just don't see him, sort of moving forward into it, and I'm skeptical as to whether, for example, Katie Potter or Liz Warren would be interested in this, and that is also another important question. But all the prescriptions of Hudson are worth pursuing. And speaking from a Marxist point of view, there are certain elements there that are just fit perfectly, and at least what I want to do from a research point of view. And I wonder why more people don't talk about it. As I've said at the beginning, modern monetary theory is only a transitional element. It does not solve the problems of capitalism. Doesn't end capitalism, but it does. And you could argue, in fact, from a Marxist point of view, that it's kind of band-aid for at least the banking system. So, from a larger revolutionary project, it's not quite the thing. But on the other hand, it is a move closer to national banks or to nationalized banking, which, depending on how it's designed, implies socialism in a future state. So I don't find that problematic, and I find that this is it solves so many problems of inequity. So I hope that you'll think about it in that way. At least read this chapter, because I think that its prescriptions. I mean, the rest of the Hudson book fills in the story. The fact, as I mentioned yesterday, the utter failure of Barack Obama to deliver what he promised. I mean, in terms of broken promise relative to solving the U.S. economy. He saved the U.S. economy on the one hand. On the other hand, he gave it to the banksters. So that's a whole nother set of questions. So whether we would have been better off with abject failure or not. But anyway, the fight for the 21st century. Alex Tsipras rejecting the Eurozone's bailout terms in 2015. If Europe wants the division and the perpetuation of servitude, we will take the plunge and issue a big no. We will fight for the dignity of the people and our sovereignty. In 1933, as the wake of World War I's financial wreckage gave way to the Great Depression, the philosopher, I guess he is a philosopher, H.G. Wells wrote a novel about the conflict he expected to emerge by the last quarter of his century. reminding his readers of the perennial struggle of life against the creditor in the dead hand. He described society's forward effort seeking to break free of past debts and financial claims. Um, Viewing debt as a retarding force, H.G. Wells forecast that matters would come to a head in the year 1979 when his fictional character Austin Liveright would publish Bankruptcy Through the Ages. We only need refer to the student to the recorded struggles in the histories of Republican Rome and Judea between debtor and creditor, the plebeian secessions of the former and the year of Jubilee of the latter. The year 1979 indeed turned out to be precisely when interest rates peaked at a modern era high of 20%. As an example of the parallel struggle against landowners seeking to avoid taxes, H.G. Wells cited England's Statutes of Mortmain, 1279 and 1290, protecting the land from passing to the church via bequests, foreclosure, or sales made to avoid the epoch's feudal duties. Throughout history, there's been a constant tension between royal or public authority and creditors or wealthy patrons seeking to indebt the land and its population to themselves so as to replace public power with their own. But whereas the great political fight in the 19th century was to nationalize or tax land and natural resource rents, today's fight must be to socialize banking and finance, which have become the ultimate recipient and hence main defender of such rents. The actual financial crisis of 1979 was resolved in a way that led in the opposite direction from what Wells had forecast and progressive economists recommended. Instead of debtors achieving a clean slate to wipe out the debt overhead, the incoming 1981 to 92 Reagan-Bush administration sponsored a wave of new credit and debt so large that interest rates declined steadily during the 1980s. At first, this debt creation was used to inflate property and stock markets, whereas the Vietnam War and ensuing Carter inflation of 1977 to 80 had bid up wages and commodity prices. The subsequent neoliberal inflation bid up asset prices, reinforced by tax cuts on real estate, capital gains, and the upper income brackets. This shift to regressive taxation was the reverse of what economists and futurists had expected. Instead of economies becoming more equal, they polarized increasingly between creditors and debtors. So let me break here for the moment and say, this is the problem that we still have. This is why the 1980s created this incredible problem in which we still exist. The Reagan-Bush budget deficits quadrupled U.S. public debt, while easier credit fueled a debt overgrowth. That became precisely what Wells foresaw and warned against. That is, a dead hand of financial claims leading to the crash of 2008 and its aftermath. Contra Wells, the world barely put up a fight to break free from this dynamic, shifting the tax burden and the cost of bank bailouts onto labor and taxpayers after 2008 gave Wall Street and its counterparts abroad the power to hold entire nations in debt. Restructuring the financial system is hard to do when people are engulfed in a crisis, especially when they imagine that they can recover by borrowing more and fear that there is no alternative to doing that. The reality is that history is rife with possible remedies. These remedies almost always involve debt write-downs. Now, what is a debt write-down? A debt write-down is an accounting term for the reduction in the book value of an asset when its fair market value, FMV, has fallen below the carrying book value, and thus it becomes an impaired asset. The amount to be written down is the difference between the book value of the asset and the amount of cash that the business can obtain by disposing of it in the most optimal manner. A write-down is the opposite of a write-up, and it will become a write-off if the entire value of the asset becomes worthless and is eliminated from the account altogether. Write-offs are an interesting question and obviously one common to capitalism. Anyway, there is an alternative. If we're designing a perfect world, we would put the economy's long-term interests above financial short-termism. We would organize banking and financial systems in a way to keep credit productive and within the ability of debtors to pay. In cases where predatory credit and debt exceeds the means to pay or threatens to impose austerity and debt deflation, it would be annulled. What a perfect world. The reason why the world isn't pursuing such restructuring is that creditors have gained power over governments and public opinion to persuade people that it's possible for economies to continue along the present path, and even that austerity can somehow restore balance and prosperity. Few people would expect that as financial crises intensify and polarize economies further between creditors and debtors, governments will fail to restructure the financial system. But von Hayek's hyperbole in his book Road to Serfdom characterizes public planning, taxation, and regulation as metaphoric serfdom. And lest you think this is unimportant, there's a shit ton of people who believe this book. This reflects the 1%'s fear and even hatred of democracy, progressive taxation, and public enterprise and social spending programs. In their place, Hayek's acolytes would set economies on the road to literal debt serfdom, a state of dependency in which access to housing and education requires taking on a lifetime of debt. That's why we are where we are. Some people actually believe this sort of Lord-bondsman dialectics, Galilean in that sense, and people really adhere to it. The way that history was supposed to unfold was that banking would provide credit for capital investment. Public services were to be offered at falling prices, ultimately freely to a widening population. But instead of evolving towards such socialism, quote unquote, bankers and wealthy elites found rent extraction to be their major source of gain. Calling their opposition to a government strong enough to keep them in check libertarian, their aim is simply to replace democratic government with planning by bankers and bondholders. To call their rent extraction and debt-financed asset price inflation or wealth creation is to adopt the vocabulary of rentiers. Now, there are 10 reforms proposed by Hudson to restore industrial prosperity. Now, note that the industrial, in this particular case, represents a more balanced economy, sort of balancing the production side with the consumption side, ultimately, departments 1 and 2, etc. And in some ways, if you're a technocrat of some kind, this actually leads to more modern, sort of outcomes. Number 1, write down debts with a clean slate, or at least in keeping with the ability to pay. Number 2, tax economic rent to save it from being capitalized into interest payments. Number 3, revoke the tax deductibility of interest to stop subsidizing debt leveraging. Number 4, create a public banking option. Number 5, fund government deficits by central banks, not by taxes to pay bondholders. Number 6, pay Social Security and Medicare out of the general budget. Number 7, keep natural monopolies in the public domain to prevent rent extraction. Number 8, tax capital gains at the higher rates levied on earned income. Number 9, deter irresponsible lending with a fraudulent conveyance principle. And number 10, David Letterman, revive the classical value and rent theory and its statistical categories. So anyway, yes, we're sort of returning to the 18th century in some ways. On the other hand, there is something to be said for 18th century revolutionary solutions. So let me just leave it at that. Write down debts. Number 1 is write down debts that block recovery. So a convulsion of bankruptcy is the price to be paid for the financial sector's sabotage of the tax system and regulatory capture of oversight agencies. Chapter 9 has described how most observers in 2008 saw that overlending for junk mortgages had caused a bubble, that is, asset price inflation, and urged that debts should be scaled back to the ability to be paid. Such write-downs in 2008 would have avoided the widespread foreclosures that threw 10 million homes onto the market at distressed prices. Banks opposed such write-downs because this would have imposed losses on themselves, their bondholders, and other financial players. The Federal Reserve created enough monetary reserves for the banks to make up for the losses, but nothing to bail out homeowners. And, they spent chapters on that. No pressure was exerted to take trouble, that is, overly aggressive and predatory banks public or prosecute their officers for the mortgage frauds and underwriting frauds that were part and parcel of the crash. The FDIC was prepared to do this with Citigroup in 2008, using the bank's surviving reserves to cover the claims of insured depositors, as distinct from stockholders, bondholders, and uninsured counterparties. But it was blocked by the Treasury. In addition to creating money directly for banks to borrow its reserves, earning a free interest markup, the Fed sought to reinflate the real estate market so that bank mortgages could recover those price levels. Banks refrained from foreclosing on homes in arrears largely to keep Fannie Mae insured loans on their books, adding late fees and penalties to their interest charges against mortgage debtors. Some of that probably happened during COVID. Bankers depict even a partial debt write-down as threatening anarchy, their euphemism for having to take a loss when the system they designed and deregulated goes bust. But the alternative to write-downs is financial breakdown and impoverishment. A clean slate would make a public option for banking easier to introduce. This would help banks evolve into public utilities. Public utilities, of course, is an oxymoron as well in the United States. But anyway, it also would facilitate the rent taxes that 19th century free market reformers intended. Trying to save appearances by keeping bad debts on the books has led to debt deflation gnawing into consumer demand and business investment. So we are left with the inconvenient truth that if financial claims are not annulled, the result must be an increasingly top-heavy oligarchy imposing chronic austerity, making it even harder to pay down the debt burden. Student loans, right? Number two, tax economic rent to save it from being capitalized into interest payments. To help prevent such financialization from occurring after a debt write-down, it is necessary to reform tax policy by focusing it on rent extraction and capital gains. Otherwise, taxes and financial markets will continue to create credit mainly against land rent for real estate, natural resource rent for the oil and mining sectors, and monopoly rent for infrastructure being privatized from the public domain. Now, that's a lot, but it compresses an entire body of capitalist behavior. Land rent heads the list because real estate remains the largest asset in nearly every economy. As Chapter 7 has described, some 80% of new bank credit takes the form of mortgage loans, whose main effect is to bid up property prices. This price rise serves as poison bait for home buyers and also activist shareholders, i.e. predators, in the stock market, hoping to get rich by debt-leveraged capital gains that increasing that net worth on paper. These gains cannot be sustained if the debt creation process smothers the economy. In 2011, the U.S. Housing Finance Agency raised its guarantee for mortgage debt service to 43% of family income, up from the customary 25% rule of thumb prior to the 1980s. That alone is the problem. Down payments were reduced in 2013 from 5% to just 3%. These looser guidelines enable families to borrow. Housing prices rise to however much the bank will lend. But instead of elevating families into the middle class, the inflation of home prices becomes a treadmill to debt peonage. Inflating prices for rent-yielding assets creates a vested interest in expanding unproductive credit creation to prevent a collapse of asset prices, leading to negative equity. This forces the economy to choose between two evils. On the one hand, yet more debt, that is, extend and pretend inherently short term, or number two, second evil, the inevitable bankruptcies and forfeitures to creditors in the end. Classical rent theory demonstrates what seems to be counterintuitive. Raising property taxes holds down what the banks will lend and hence the price of housing. because rent paid to the tax collector is not available to be capitalized into bank debt. But the financial sector popularizes the illusion, and this is Prop 13 at all, popularizes the illusion that lower property taxes will make home ownership more affordable. This is the entire problem of California financing. But anyway, bankers know that lower taxes, and it's worse, as a side comment, it's worse for states smaller than California. But anyway, that's the bankers know that lower taxes will leave more of the property's rental value available for new buyers to pay interest or existing owners to borrow against by taking out, quote unquote, home equity loans. What homeowners seem to gain in property tax cuts ends up being paid in higher mortgage costs of buying homes. Now, that's not a perfect trade-off, but anyway. Taxing land rent and also natural resource rent and monopoly rent has three positive effects. First, taxing land rent keeps property prices low by preventing this rent from being capitalized into bank loans. Secondly, it frees labor and industry from taxes on wages, profits, and sales, alleviating most family budgets. Thirdly, taxing land rent, banks will be obliged not to create as much new debt that merely just comes from a cost of transferring ownership rather than contributing to real output and productivity. Taxing rent is administratively easy. The United States has over 20,000 appraisers whose job is to assess the market value of buildings and land separately. That's actually not enough, and AI could change all of that. But anyway, that's another story. In the case of natural resources, oil and mining companies typically buy crude from producer countries at low prices, reflecting actual production costs. Payment is made by tax avoidance flag of convenient countries such as Panama or Liberia, which conveniently use the US dollar, which sell the oil at a markup to refineries in the oil-consuming nations. This markup is pure resource rent, not profit in the classical sense. It is untaxed. Yes, that's true. And in fact, without a great lengthy explanation, I would assert that the shadow tankers that the Russians are using to move their crude is exactly taking advantage of that, except on the ruble. For monopolies, economic rent is revenue that cannot be explained by spending on tangible capital investment and labor. There's a long tradition of untangling the maze of fictitious cost accounting. During World War II, the U.S. government applied this principle in its excess profits tax, because there were war profiteers, much as earlier regulators calculated fair market value for railroad tariffs. That's a whole nother historical story, and other monopoly services. At least this is what they were supposed to do. Investment bankers put free lunch rent rights at the top of their wish list of assets to be privatized, untaxed, and regulated, precisely because these are cash cows, much like lotteries and other public revenue streams. So there's this whole thing that gets created, right? The California lottery occurred because of Prop 13. A debt-ridden, regressively taxed economy in which fortunes are based on rent extraction and by financial claims on the nation for interest, amortization, and fees is higher cost than an equity economy basing its tax system on land rent, natural resource rent, and regulating monopoly pricing. If such rentier income is unearned and hence unfair, then so are the fortunes and hereditary estates built up from such income. Fortunately, rent takings are reversible. A rent tax can recapture what privatizers and kleptocrats have taken. At issue in today's new enclosure movement, and I'll just leave that open in the sense that new enclosure can include, and I'm just doing an aside here, but this is really important. Donald Trump has proposed 10 freedom cities or liberty cities, or whatever the hell they're called. And in fact, it is simply an example of a new enclosure movement, complete with segregation, racism, and other benefits. To privatize economic rent are two visions of capitalism: financial versus industrial. A bubble economy's mode of creating wealth by, number one, debt leveraging, see Trump, and number two, taxing labor and consumers rather than economic rent, has made America a high-cost economy. So imagine what the Trumpian liberty or freedom cities will do. On the one hand, they will develop, all kinds of things and maybe taxable, but you can never tell with red states, and they're largely red states, boondoggles. But anyway, that's another story. To be sure, if governments collect the land rent, many existing property owners will default on the payments to the bank or feel obliged to walk away from their property. When banks do not receive what they had set their eyes on, many will see that their reserves wiped out even more dramatically than occurred in 2008. An abrupt shift in taxing rents or other revenue already pledged to banks will decimate their stockholders and bondholders. Taxing rent will thus require a public takeover of such troubled banks. Darn nationalism. The financial sector is forced society to make a choice. Either submit to turning the economy into a rentier-ridden Ponzi scheme, see Trump, or subordinate the banking and tax system to the aim of financing growth. That's why reform must be across the board and not piecemeal, not in 50 pieces. It should happen at a federal level in that context. It's hard to see how economic rent can be fully taxed without a public option for banking because the rent to be taxed already has been earmarked to pay interest. Something has to give. Being taken into the public domain is the price that banks pay for overlending to the point where interest charges often absorb the entire economic rent and crowd out the tax collector while forcing indebted owners to default. Under these conditions, turning insolvent banks into public institutions is the easiest alternative to financial austerity and anarchy. Number 3, revoke the tax deductibility of interest. Interest is not a cost of doing business when it's paid to transfer ownership rights to existing properties or enterprises. Debt taken on simply to buy assets is pure overhead, adding to the cost of doing business. Making interest payments on such transactions tax deductible enables the 1% to take more from industry, real estate, and commerce. This perverse incentive enables industrial firms to be raided by financial tactics to pay out more to bondholders than they can to stockholders by paying income that otherwise would be declared as taxable profit. This encourages debt leveraging rather than equity investment, especially for leveraged buyouts that add interest charges to the cost of business. Tax deductibility for interest also adds to the cost of living to the extent that it shifts the tax burden onto wage income and consumer sales. Yet politicians end up giving tax advantages to creditors because the financial sector has become their main constituency of campaign financial contributors. Just as in the case of leaving economic rent untaxed, untaxing interest payments leaves more after-tax real estate rent and corporate cash flow free to be capitalized into larger loans that raise asset prices for new buyers on credit. The untaxed interest ends up being paid to bankers and bondholders. This transformation of rents and tax cuts into interest, that is creating capital gains in the process, that thing, capital gains, throws Wall Street's backing behind an anti-growth tax policy whose main product is debt. The convoluted rewriting and watering down of Dodd-Frank bank legislation has shown how bank lobbyists are able to stall reforms and water them down by inserting fatal loopholes. Wall Street's sway over lawmaking and courts, its capture of oversight agencies, and political control over campaign financing forces economies to take radical steps to save themselves from austerity and debt peonage. And this happens at the state level. And radical steps, by their nature, must be abrupt. To be effective, systemic reform must be done quickly and totally, not slowly and marginally. So there's some suggestions here, of course, and you'll see people really complain if this really did happen. Number 4, create a public banking option. Chapter 7 has shown that banking was on its way to becoming a public utility in the years leading up to World War I. A public option survives in the post office banks of Japan and Russia and exists only in name, of course, in a variety of European banks, European postal, whatever, the PPEs or whatever the hell they're called. PTEs. PTEs. Anyway, by providing deposit and checking accounts, loans, and credit cards at rates reflecting the actual cost of such services, or even at subsidized rates instead of today's interest charges, fees, and penalties, a public option could free the economy from the monopoly rent now enjoyed by banks. Most important, public banking would have been unlikely to extend credit for the corporate takeovers, asset stripping, and debt leveraging that characterizes today's financial system. There are three main arguments for establishing a public bank to provide basic checking, savings, and credit card services. The most obvious reason is to offer these services at minimum cost. A public option is free from exorbitant salaries and stock options, management fees, and other financialization tactics, not to mention political lobbying and fines for the now chronic misbehavior of the largest bank. The second reason for creating a public bank is the ability of Wall Street lobbyists to undermine administration of Sarbanes-Oxley, Dodd-Frank, and the Volcker too big to fail rule, and to block the appointment of Justice Department or Securities and Exchange Commission officials who actually believe in enforcing regulation. As long as both leading political parties, Democrats and Republicans, view throwing financial criminals in jail as, quote unquote, the road to serfdom, the only way to prevent reckless bank exploitation is to set up public banks dedicated to providing basic vanilla services. The third reason for creating a public option for banking is to separate retail banking from the investment banking that is becoming almost indistinguishable from casino trading and arbitrage and derivatives. The failure of existing legislation to restore Glass-Steagall separation of these two quite different forms of banking, coupled with the inability of Congress to protect the economy from this financial sector, has produced a situation where mega banks can hold the government hostage for bailouts when the exponential growth of financial claims bursts into a repeat of the 2008 solvency crisis. Finally, it's just easier for governments to cancel debts owed to themselves than to annul those owed to private creditors. Before credit became privatized, Mesopotamian kings and Egyptian pharaohs canceled debts owed to the palace so as to avoid widespread bondage and immigration, the fate confronting today's debt-strapped countries. Number 5, we're halfway through. Fund government deficits by central banks and not by taxes. Money has always been a public creation. The paper money in our pocket is a form of government debt. The government created it as a kind of IOU when it paid for goods and services. That is how governments supply economies with money. The holders of such currency, in turn, are in the position of being creditors to the rest of the economy and pay with this credit, which is given value by the government accepting as payment for, more specifically, taxes. This is the essence of modern monetary theory, explained best by the followers of Hyman Minsky at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, Randy Ray at Bard, and Steve Keen at Sydney, University of Sydney. Public debt, including the money supply, would not exist if the government did not run up debts century after century, just like other countries. The deficit is what creates the economy's monetary base, which rises each year in proportion to the increase in public debt. Unlike personal debts, public debts are not expected to be repaid. To do so would extinguish the money supply. That is what happened in the late 19th century in the United States, and it imposed a serious deflation, that is the cross of gold that was crucifying debtors who earned less and less income to pay debts taken on at higher prices. William Jennings Bryan. And the silver crisis at the end of the 19th century, blah, blah, blah. The role of central banks is to create money electronically, to spend into the economy to spur economic growth without entailing interest-bearing debt owed to commercial banks and bondholders. That's why financial elites oppose central bank financing of deficits. Bondholders prefer to keep governments on a taut financial leash, with central banks creating money only to bail out banks, not the economy. Bankers accuse governments of depreciating the currency and creating hyperinflation. Yet over the past 30 years, banks have financed the greatest inflation of real estate, stock, and bond prices in history. This certainly is not a more morally responsible form of inflation than government spending. Central banks were founded to finance deficit spending, but in recent decades, the financial sectors turned them into appendages of the privatized banking system. At the Federal Reserve, helicopter Ben Bernanke and his successor, Janet Yellen, airdropped money only over Wall Street, a net $4 trillion of electronic credit to U.S. banks since the 2008 crisis. Well, that's a lot more now. This quantitative easing, QE, did not finance investment in new industrial capital, repair deteriorating bridges, roads, and other infrastructure, or maintain employment. Now, that has changed under the Biden administration. Its aim was simply to prop up bank balance sheets by supporting prices for real estate mortgages. That is to save banks, not the economy. Reinflating asset prices make it more expensive for families to buy homes, reducing their purchasing power for goods and services. Wall Street has mounted a propaganda campaign to convince voters that government budgets should be run like household budgets, in balance or even surplus. The difference is households cannot create money, period. And that's a question. I have the question I want to ask Barack Obama if I ever meet him personally. But anyway, removing the constraint of silver or gold backing for money has enabled banks to create credit without limit, except for government regulation and capital reserve requirements. Disabling public regulatory power has left credit creation to the commercial banks, which inflate asset prices on credit, adding interest charges to the economy's ownership structure. Asset price inflation became the focus of bank lending and seemed to justify yet more bank lending as an incoming economy-wide Ponzi scheme. There is an alternative. The Eurozone could have created a few trillion-dollar platinum coins to finance deficit spending directly into the economy to help pull it out of austerity. They could have let the superstructure of bank derivatives collapse, wiping out financial gambles that put the banking system at risk. Now, there's a problem in doing that, and it just seems bizarre with all due respect. So I decided to let Gemini calculate the weight of a 1 trillion euro platinum coin. A 1 trillion euro platinum coin would weigh 776,700 metric tons, which would mean that a coin this heavy can be pretty big. Be hard to store or move around, and minting it would be terrible. So, while theoretically possible, creating a $1 trillion or trillion euro platinum coin is not a practical solution for financing deficit spending. More likely that the Eurozone would use other methods, such as government bonds or quantitative easing, to inject money into the economy. Needless to say, that has its own issues. Anyway, that's an aside. It was just an intellectual exercise, and I hadn't thought about how do you calculate $1 trillion coin and what would it weigh, and so that's what it would weigh in 2016 or whatever. But bank lobbyists and right-wing ideologues have propagandized a narrow tunnel vision to prevent the United States from creating money for other reasons than to benefit Wall Street, and to prevent the European Union from having a real central bank to finance government deficits, except to help bankers and bondholders. The pretense is that money is technocratic and requires professional, defined as suitably tunnel vision anti-government ideologues. Ottawa economics professor Mario Scareccia recently summarized how radical this anti-democratic view of money is. Ever since the establishment of the modern nation state in the late 18th and 19th centuries, the creation of the euro was perhaps the first significant experiment in modern times in which there was an attempt to separate money from the state, that is, to denationalize currency, as some right-wing ideologues and founders of modern neoliberalism, such as Friedrich von Hayek, had defended. The denationalization or supranationalization of money with the establishment that happened in the Eurozone took away from elected national governments the capacity to meaningfully manage their economy. Unless governments in the Eurozone are able to renegotiate a significant control and access money from their own central banks, the system will be continually plagued with crisis and probably collapse in the longer term. This is that underlying issue of why doesn't all of Europe, even though they have a economic connection in terms of the ECC or whatever the hell it is, EEC, why they don't all use the euro, and goes to Brexit and a bunch of other deals. To make matters worse, the hands of central banks in Europe and the United States are tied by the impression, sponsored by financial lobbyists, that governments should not run deficits but maintain surpluses that drain the economy's circular flow and oblige it to rely on commercial banks and bondholders. Instead of public credit financing economic growth, bank debt is monetized in ways that benefit creditors at the expense of their host economies. For example, although Citigroup and AIG bailouts were financed with a stroke of a pen, Social Security, Medicare, and other social spending likewise can be financed by the central bank creating money, just as created money to bail out Wall Street. Even worse, FICA, remember I talked about your pay stub. FICA wage withholding pays for these programs in advance, lending this forced savings to the U.S. Treasury so that taxes can be slashed further for the highest wealth brackets. The essence of modern monetary theory, MMT, it's governments can finance deficit spending electronically on its own computer keyboards, just like commercial banks do. The difference between public money creation and bank credit is that the public purpose is to promote economic growth, not asset price inflation. It seems like a no-brainer, but whatever. National prosperity requires spending money into the economy, for instance, for new capital infrastructure investment, healthcare, and retirement pensions. Budget surpluses would oblige such spending to be privately financed, which means much higher prices for their services. Number 6, we're getting there. Pay Social Security and Medicare out of the general budget. In 1983, the Commission on Social Security Reform, chaired by Alan Greenspan, recommended that instead of treating Social Security and Medicare as public programs funded out of the overall budget, they should be privatized into a savings program paid for mainly by the least affluent members of society by steadily raising the FICA payroll tax. These wage withholding taxes are now over 15%, including the employer's 6.2% share of Social Security levies. They do not fall on high income earners. This regressive tax shift away from the higher income brackets functions as a fiscal class war. It has cost wage earners, most of us, hundreds of billions of dollars. The government has raised user fee taxes on wage earners up to a low cutoff point, freeing earners of more than $120,000 from having to contribute. Such user fees are imposed on banks for their $4 trillion in Federal Reserve quantitative easing credit, the $800 billion TARP bailout and other subsidies, and also, the military industrial complex, etc. Any politician who fails to explain that it is regressive income taxation to subsidize the 1% in this way, but not Social Security, can be assumed to be in Wall Street's pocket or the proverbially useful idiot. The effect of self-funding social spending is to impose austerity on the 99%, freeing the 1% from fiscal responsibility. And we see this in business journalism reporting, right? Bezos pays whatever minimal amount of taxes, and Musk pays no taxes. Number 7, keep natural monopolies in the public domain to prevent rent extraction. Financial lobbyists condemn public spending as deadweight, even for roads, the post office, and other basic infrastructure. They claim that privatization will provide these services at lower prices than government can match. Yet all the evidence points to the contrary. Just think about toll roads. This is largely because in today's world, privatization involves financialization, adding charges for interest, dividends, and exorbitant salaries to managers to the break-even prices that must be charged, not to mention using profits or rents for stock buybacks to create capital gains for managers and owners. Over and above these costs, privatizers charge as high a price as the market will bear. It's the difference between going to FedEx and the USPS. This margin is monopoly rent. It was to prevent this price gouging that vital infrastructure traditionally was kept in the public domain. Since antiquity, roads and transportation, canals and civic buildings have been so expensive that private ownership would have exacerbated wealth inequality and created monopolistic elites. Even medieval serfs at least had access rights to the commons to help provide for their livelihood. And you can see that basic constriction in terms of access to public land versus, people constantly attempting to privatize it for their own, pleasure, like beachfront property, whatever. Monopolies were privatized more in the U.S. than in Europe during the Progressive era. So U.S. techniques of price regulation for electric utilities and railroads was more developed than elsewhere. Price gouging was analyzed as an excess of market price over carefully defined intrinsic and necessary cost value. There are actually equations for this. But Europe kept basic infrastructure in the public domain, so there was less of a regulatory tradition for the sectors privatized after 1980, but it got all screwed up, of course, Thatcherism, etc. And no such tradition existed when the Soviet Union's republics became independent in 1991. Their rent extracting gravatization was more extreme than anywhere else in the world. And you can see this actually in the structure of so-called public utilities in the Russian context. Today's new enclosure movement, I talked about Trump cities, is privatizing public infrastructure. These giveaways of the modern day commons, that is, federal land, are attracting new buyers who borrow to buy these monopoly privileges and pay banks interest out of the prices they charge. Privatization provides banks with a loan market, capitalizing rent extraction rights into bond stocks and bank loans. The Thatcher-Blair model for public-private partnerships, and I've talked about PPP before, it breaks towards the private. In other words, PPPs tend to be, 1/3 public and 2/3 private, and with all due respect, it's never 50-50. Typifies this giveaway of public assets. Chicago's financialization of it, this is actually a good story and probably worth even looking at in detail. Chicago's financialization of its sidewalk parking meters is a notorious U.S. example. And you don't even have to go at a big scale like that. I used to have a friend who was in charge of parking in dormitories in the University of California system. And, well, not in charge of all of it, but worked on it. And it exists separately, that is, parking in dormitories are a separate financial kind of thing, and it can pull a profit if it wants. It doesn't have any constraints from the state government. So it can do all kinds of crazy crap. This underwriting gave banks a strong motive to drive government out of the business of providing public services or of regulating and taxing rent-yielding enterprises. Short of deprivatizing, that is, renationalizing land, natural resources, and monopolies to the public domain, the remedy is a rent tax backed by a tax on excess profits and unexplained enrichment. Tax capital gains at the same progressive rates as earned income. Number 8. Some 80% of capital gains are in real estate, reflecting its dominant size in the economy. As in the stock and bond markets, most such gains do not reflect tangible capital investment, but result mainly from banks lending more as they loosen credit standards. See, this is all made up stuff, right? It's capital. For example, for junk mortgage lending in 2001 to 2008. That's what, Hudson spends great time explaining that. Real estate prices rise when central banks lower the interest rate at which profits and rents are capitalized into bank loans. The freer the lunch, the more pressure is brought on governments to make rentier gains even larger by taxing them even less. Real estate gains are not taxed if they're reinvested in new property or if nominal ownership is located in, yes, tax havens or when owners die, a whole nother set of things. Wall Street traders enjoy a similar loophole that taxes their financial winnings at a low capital gains rate. And you can see that this is just lobbying. There's a result of lobbying. The remedy is to tax asset price gains at least as high as the maximum income tax rate. And you just, libertarians will say, oh, well, a flat tax will do all that. No, it won't. Otherwise, the economy will favor such gains over those from tangible investment. Number nine, deter irresponsible lending with a fraudulent conveyance or odious debt rule. The most obvious way to deter overlending would be to make lenders bear the cost of loans gone bad. And note that overlending, there's a whole incentive for it, right? If you're a banker and you know, pretend that you can give away all this stuff and not really back it properly, it's go crazy. Loans made without a reasonable analysis to ascertain that they can be repaid in the normal course of business would be deemed to have been made fraudulently. Companies defending themselves against raiders in the 1980s cited the fraudulent conveyance principle to claim that the junk bonds and bank loans financing the buyouts could only be paid by carving up the company, downgrading its pension plan, or closing down its long-term investment. For public debt, the guiding principle should be that bondholders should lose if the only way that can be paid is by imposing austerity, unemployment, and forced emigration or sell-off in the public domain. No nation should be compelled to pay creditors before meeting its own economic survival needs. And so there was this, in the prior 10 chapters, there was discussion of the Greek crisis and blah, 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 which we sort of lionize Yanis Varoufakis, but, it's not simply, it's about political power. It's less about, saving the Greek economy. I mean, I think it's really important, and many people are incredibly proud that Yanis was the finance minister, but the politics gets in the way. It's similar to our kind of lionizing Bernie Sanders. As Greece's debt negotiations are coming to a head, the Parliamentary Debt Truth Committee stated the problem on June 17, 2015. People's dignity is worth more than illegal, illegitimate, odious, and unsustainable debt. The demands by the Troika were found to be aimed exclusively at shifting private debt onto the public sector. The report describes how this asset stripping, combined with demands for austerity, was the legacy of the Troika's bailout of Greece that only helped private bondholders, not the Greek economy. All the evidence we were presented in this report shows that Greece not only does not have the ability to pay this debt, but should also not pay this debt, first and foremost, because the debt emerging from the Troika's arrangement is a direct infringement of the fundamental human rights of the residents of Greece. Hence, we came to the conclusion that Greece should not pay this debt because it's illegal, illegitimate, and odious. That issue is whether society will save indebted economies or their creditors. Bankers cry havoc at the thought of annulling debts that can't be paid, as if the thought is unthinkable. But it is less radical than turning economies into the debt-ridden wasteland that was inflicted upon Greece. From a historical point of view, it's more radical to let debt deflation deepen austerity while banks foreclose on property than for governments to protect debtors whose ranks constitute the vast majority of the population and businesses. Realism and maintenance of viable markets requires recognition that in the end, as was mentioned above, most debts can't be paid. At present, we're living in a financial interregnum. If the debt buildup continues, the economy cannot avoid an exponentially deepening debt crisis as it follows an exponential Ponzi scheme vector. This is what Trumpism has given us in the U.S. Banks and bondholders will continue as long as they can until real reforms are made and rules are set to define the conditions under which debts should be canceled when they become disruptive on an economy-wide scale. Number 10, and we're almost at the end, revive classical value and price theory with special emphasis on debt. As chapter 3 is described, Francois Canet developed national income accounting to trace how much rent was taken and what did the landlords do with it. The subsequent value and price theory of Adam Smith and David Ricardo served to isolate economic rent, enabling John Stuart Mill and other Ricardian socialists who would demonstrate that taxing rent recaptures for society the natural resource patrimony and rising site value. This rental valuation is created not by landlord efforts, but by society's overall prosperity and public investment in commodities like transportation systems, schools, and other infrastructure that define location, location, location. This is where neo-Ricardianism sort of comes to the fore. The fight to recover land and natural resource rents for public use, along with making natural monopolies public, including banking, was waged in nearly every industrial nation in the decades leading up to World War I. This question here is one that underlies the issues of progressivism, etc., the progressivism of the turn of the century from the 19th to 20th century. Taxing rent aimed to lower taxes on consumers and industry, while public infrastructure lowered the prices of key economic needs. The past centuries reversed matters by privatizing land's site value, mineral rents, and basic infrastructure rents to be paid mainly to banks as interest. Now, seeking to erase memory of classical rent theory, today's financial power grab pretends that Adam Smith and his followers sought to free such rent seeking from taxation and regulation, not free economies from rentier elites. Now, that's the key point. And certainly the issue of the antagonism of rentier elites and everybody else is, what Marx is sort of thinking about. Failure to create a more progressive tax system reflects the inability of 19th century free market doctrine to achieve the political and lawmaking power needed to liberate economies from the vestiges of feudalism. This is what Yanis is talking about, techno-feudalism. Number one, landlordism stemming from the military conquest of Europe and the regions it colonized. And number two, banking in private hands with creditor-oriented laws. And three, monopolies created by public fiat and sold to pay royal war debts, or more recently, deficits from cutting taxes on rentiers and the rest of the 1%. So, as a solution, how to manage a debt write-down, whereas the fight of the 19th century was to nationalize land, natural resources, and monopolies. Today's fight is to socialize banking and finance. By becoming the ultimate rent recipients, banks and bondholders have emerged as the major defenders of rent seeking. Having made collateralized rent-extracting privileges the basis of our credit system, that is, mortgage debts and those of oil and privatized monopolies, banks can argue that reviving the classical program of taxing economic rents will bring down the financial system, turning these rents into interest and backing the economy's savings. These savings are highly concentrated in the hands of the 1%, to be sure. But the symbiosis between banking, real estate, and monopolies, the fire sector ostensibly, has enabled these rentiers to depict their interests as being those of labor and industry, if one leaves out of account the concept of economic rent and unearned income and its fictive wealth. The reform cited above cannot be achieved as long as the debt overhead remains. Even with current rent extraction in place, spurring recovery requires freeing businesses and families from the debt burden. History shows how excessive rent extraction and not forgiving debts reduce economies to debt servitude and collapse. But it also reveals that there's always been a wide range of alternatives to reverse the spread of indebtedness. If clean slate seems so radical as to be nearly unthinkable today, it is mainly because rentier ideology has suppressed awareness of most of civilization's customary proclamations spanning 3,000 years from Mesopotamia and Egypt to Athens, Sparta, and Judea. Proclaiming clean slates to restore economic balance, annulling the accumulation of debts when they grow beyond the ability to be paid, kept pre-Roman civilization financially stable. Mosaic law placed this principle at the core of Jewish religion, Leviticus 25, yet modern Christianity all but ignores the fact that in Jesus' first sermon, Luke 4, he unrolled the scroll of Isaiah and announced his mission to proclaim the year of the Lord as the Jubilee year was known. Restoring the Jubilee year became the basis for early Christians to break away from Rabbi Hillel, whose gospel clause was used by creditors to force debtors to waive their rights to a clean slate. Jesus' position, reflected also in the Dead Sea Scrolls of the Essenes, prompted the wealthy establishment to fight so strongly against him. By this time, it was too late to win the fight against Rome, certainly, and its increasingly violent creditor class that ended up bequeathing a pro-creditor, post-Roman law to Western civilization. And this goes all the way up through Anglo-American law. It should not be surprising that the lesson of financial history is that debts that can't be paid won't be. The great policy question of our time is not is how not to pay them. Will nations permit creditors to foreclose and take the public and private assets into their hands, holding populations in bondage? Or will they declare a clean slate and start again? Imagine that as a political, trope. Anyway, something must give. Either finance capitalism or the post-rentier industrial capitalism that seemed to be evolving towards socialism a century ago. And that is the crisis towards the end of the 19th century. Merely marginal reforms cannot save a badly warped economy. And yes, let's not idealize the end of the 19th century. It was badly warped also. So much of the economy's land rent, natural resource rent, monopoly rent, industrial profits, personal income, and central bank money creation has been attached to pay bankers and bondholders that the only means of reform is a thoroughgoing clean slate. At the end of today's dynamic of interest-bearing debt and a dysfunctional financial and tax system is an economic dark age and privatization of the commons. And yes, economic dark age and privatization of the commons is ahead. And with all due respect, it'll be digital, hence techno-feudalism. When rentiers insist there's no alternative, they mean that they have attached and interwoven their debt and property claims so tightly throughout the economy that any systemic alternative threatens chaos in the short run. Their aim is to limit any reforms to merely marginal scope, leaving the present financial and rent-extracting system in place. Banks and bondholders hate classical political economy because its logical conclusion was what was called socialism before today's quote-unquote socialist parties changed the meaning to endorse neoliberal austerity. Marx became the bête noire of vested rentier interests because he showed how the dynamics of industrial capitalism were radical in striving to subordinate the landed financial and monopoly interests that survived from feudalism. This is that the social structure of accumulation, the techno-feudalism that still remains. And the British case is the most obvious case because you still have royalty. This required a strong enough government to cope with the rentier interests and break their post-feudal stranglehold. Instead of that future materializing, a financial counter-revolution strives to convince voters that a government strong enough to regulate and tax fire, that is finance, insurance, and real estate, is the road to serfdom. That's the parasite strategy, to numb the host's brain so that it doesn't realize that the free luncher is draining the host's growth for itself. So this is reconfiguring, with all due respect, the parasitic analogy of the 19th century writing about the class antagonisms. There are a number of ways to cut the fortunes of the 1% back to what used to be deemed a normal. This is just, you could say that it was somewhat normal even at the end of World War II. Many such policies were suggested in the wake of the 2008 crisis. They involved scaling back debts to market prices in the context of the ability to pay out of current incomes. So this is just creating parity between, wages and prices and all that other stuff. The vast category of owner-occupied homes, for example, one way is to assess the market rental value, and this is problematic for all kinds of other reasons, for over-mortgaged properties, and make this the monthly payment capitalized into a self-amortizing 30-year mortgage. Well, yes and no. The bank, and more to the point, its bondholders and uninsured counterparties would absorb the loss, having overlent against the property's value. Now, this requires a certain type of transparency that we just don't have. Another solution would be to get an honest appraisal of the property's market price, and this is a whole nother set of issues and that are, AI and digital related, and write down the debt to this level, which was supposed to be what banks lent in the first place. A third approach would be to calculate the occupant's actual income, not the liar's loan figure filled in by the bank's mortgage broker, and set the mortgage payment at a specified portion. For example, the once traditional 25%. Congress established write-downs along such lines as a condition of PARP in October 2008. But as Chapter 11 has described, not Chapter 11 in bankruptcy, but Chapter 11 in Hudson's book, Incoming President Obama's choice was to leave these debts in place. In 1931, the world economy recognized a need for a clean slate by declaring a moratorium on the dead hand of intergovernmental debt stemming from World War I. That's really important, except, intergovernmental debts and, reparations, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, a similar act is needed today for today's sovereign debts in the Eurozone and indeed throughout much of the global economy. The model remains that of Germany's economic miracle. Needless to say, there's the Marshall Plan and blah, blah, blah. In 1948, the Allies enacted their currency reform, canceling all debts except for the wage obligations that businesses owed to their employees, plus modest personal and business savings and checking accounts up to a specified amount for basic transactions. The German economy was made essentially debt-free. That was the miracle, and what made its free market economy viable, a debt-free market. It was politically easy for the Allies to cancel German debts because nearly all were owed to former Nazi supporters. But today's banks and bondholders are not Nazis, but they hold the reins of government. Their treasurers, central banks, the IMF and ECB, and they might as well be Nazis. These creditor interests instinctively put up their own gains about the aim of economic recovery to the point that ends up being self-defeating, maybe even, not patriotic, bringing down the whole financial superstructure. Now, what if the debts aren't canceled? One way or another, today's debts will not be paid. That's just, whatever. They're too large to be paid off without further impoverishing economies and leading to further waves of default. But in the interim, until the hopelessness is recognized, a steady stream of foreclosures and privatizations will polarize economies between creditors and debtors. Sooner or later, economies will recognize that they must choose between becoming an increasingly polarized financial oligarchy or making a fresh start by clearing away the residue of overlending and financial malstructuring. More people could all be armed, I suppose. The political problem blocking debt write-downs is that one party's debts, mainly that of the 99%, or another's savings, especially those of the 1%. It's not possible to annul debts on the liability side of the balance sheet without wiping out savings on the asset side. As long as savings, mainly by the 1%, takes the form of debt claims on the rest of society, now that's where it needs to be worked out, right? That's where, digital processes can take hold, or even artificial intelligence. They will grow exponentially to hold the 99% in deepening debt thrall, monopolizing the surplus in a way that shrinks the economy. The present course is for governments to support the financial sector, not bring debts within the ability to pay. The one-sided U.S. support for creditors since 2008 has averted a debt write-down. Early in 2013, the Fed announced that it would buy $40 billion of mortgage-backed securities each month, almost $500 billion over the course of the year, while the government's housing agencies guaranteed some 90% of the securitized mortgage packages being written. Financial Times columnist Gillian Tett described this government activism as a travesty of a free market. Banks stopped writing new mortgages unless the government took all the risk, as also is the case with student loans. Note, by guaranteeing payment out of the public purse in the event that homeowners cannot afford to pay the debt revival. Observing that and you can see that the student loans, this is a marginal solution in terms of the kind of way they've been approaching the Biden administration, has at least been approaching the student debt. And yes, people are pissed off and blah, 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 but whatever. That cited observing that state support like this is unprecedented anywhere in the Western world, Pett cited former Treasury Secretary Paulson's warning. Today, the government is guaranteeing 90% of the mortgages. If the government keeps doing this and markets aren't allowed to work, we'll be right back where we were in 2007 and 2008. Today's government intervention is not socialism. The appropriate word is oligarchy. Debt protests from Iceland to Greece and Spain are rejecting bondholder demands for austerity and privatization sell-offs, voting pro-creditor regimes out of office and demanding referendums over whether to pay financial tribute to creditors. That is why creditors are shifting their support away from democracies to insist that their designated technocrat lobbyists, techno-feudalism, be assigned control of economic policy. Bondholders, we're almost at the end. Bondholders see rising pressure for debt write-downs as an assault on their idea of free markets, but their idea of freedom connotes debt serfdom for the population at large. Their travesty of the classical idea of free markets poses the implicit question: if governments are to intervene to enforce creditor claims and bail out banks while imposing austerity, why not act instead on the side of the indebted majority? Yeah, why not? Why not choose growth rather than shrinkage ending in bankruptcy? The costs are actually much less because financial recklessness would be avoided. This engages an entire analysis that can be built somewhat on the issue of what counts as risk, capital risk. Unthinkable as a broad debt cancellation might seem, once we recognize it's impossible to pay today's volume of debt, at least without tearing society apart and imposing financial neo-feudalism, techno-feudalism, what remains practical is that the debts won't be paid. There ultimately is no revenue to pay. If we acknowledge this fact, then as Sherlock Holmes remarked in The Barrel Coronet, it's an old maxim of mine that when you exclude the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. Now, it's sort of a pastiche on the difference between induction and deductive reasoning. But anyway, the truth is, today's debt overhead can't be paid, period. Today's political fight concerns just how they won't be paid. If government debts to foreign creditors are paid by forced privatization sell-offs, the former public domain and infrastructure will be turned into rent extraction, toll booth opportunities, and economies will be impoverished by rentier austerity. And that's the end of the damn book. And I hope you got something out of it. It seemed to me, by the time I got to the end of this, it seemed to me that Steve Keen and Yanis Varoufakis need to have a conversation I've been hunting around for at one moment that they actually talk to each other, or Steve Keen and Yanis Varoufakis. So, and yes, I know that MMT folks talk with, other folks like Varoufakis, and of course, Rick Wolf has talked to Yanis Varoufakis. So, it's not like nobody talks to anyone else. So, and Varoufakis and Stiglitz, talk and blah, blah, blah. So this is not totally alien. It's just that politics is all part of this. And of course, academia has another issue. And it would just simply be interesting to see a lot more research done. It would be interesting just to not let Varoufakis run the Fed, because, you probably couldn't rationalize it. But it just seems to me that there's other things that could be done. And then I discovered, of course, H.G. Wells' The Shape of Things to Come, and I think now I have to start reading novels again. All right. I think I've said enough. Let me see if there's anything in the chat other than the usual brickbats or woohoo, big spender, PPPs, Qs, lies, deceit, horror stories. Toxic debt. Who to educate is. Yes, I do think that that's something that ought to be done. I mean, and I am just surprised there's not enough action being moved in this direction, even though, of course, Stephanie Kelton, was a Bernie Sanders advisor, and then there was she was on the Senate committee that was revising the budget and blah, blah, blah. And then there's what's her face in the Council of Economic Advisors. But, I'm just not seeing enough of this. Heather Bushy, who's on the Council of Economic Advisors and blah, blah, blah. I'm sorry, was I talking too softly? I was yelling as much as I can. So I think I got through all 22 of the interventions in the chat. Anything else? Brickbats.
Your volume is low.
Low?
Low and behold.
It's cranked all. I'm not trying to prove you wrong. I
I
just,
did have one kind of general question. And maybe I missed it. I was that list of 10 things, was that prioritized? I mean, and then I was wondering, does he suggest like, do you try to
which
approach
comes first?
Congress with it? Yeah, right. Do you do it as a
No,
package deal or, in
well, I think you
thirds or
have to
what?
do them all at once. I mean, but then
Yeah.
again, I'm a bit of a Stalinist about these things. Just do them all the fuck at once. But whatever.
Right on. Yeah, that sounds good to me too. Rip the Band-Aid off. But yeah, I mean, part of that, my comment about number zero is like, there has to be some kind of de-education or,
Oh yeah,
some
absolutely, absolutely.
countering the propaganda and like, adding like what is it, that accounting thing that's missing or it's like misaccounting for the
Oh yeah,
financial.
absolutely. Yes.
Yeah.
As I've said before, I mean, if you actually reorganize the Fed to include some new financial categories, you might actually be, move in the right direction. It doesn't take a lot of work. Well, I mean, at an institutional level, getting getting banks to agree or whatever, and it might be, and you could cause this incredible, bizarre panic, I assume. But if you designed it properly, note that something like 20 to 30 banks fold every year. In the Great Depression, I think it was only 280 banks that folded. Now that's only, but I'm
Hmm.
not talking about size, but banks close every year, so it's not like you're going to screw the system completely, unless they want to screw the system, which they could do in a sort of seppuku kind of deal. But I would hope that they wouldn't do that.
Yikes.
But I think if you leveraged it with some other economy, maybe even a socialist economy, you could work out something that would move it into an interesting place. Uh, I'm not sure you could do that, but let's say if you were really thinking hard, you could redesign NAFTA 2.0 to do from a regional point of view to get some of that to work properly relative to the three different banking systems. But anyway, that would just be me. And then go from there. Then move to the G7 and then to the G20 and have a whole thing in the UN supporting financial reorganization because the non-aligned countries would go for it. Well, anyway. Anything else? And yes, I did say the F word, and I apologize. I apologize to you too, and anybody who's actually listening. Well, they're not listening really; they're just waiting for the algorithm. Anyone else?
So, and you mentioned in there that um, low property taxes result in higher home prices. Um, so if you raise property taxes, it'll result in, it won't result in more affordability though.
No. Um,
But I guess
you want to what you want is not an individual case. That's a micro question, but you do it at this larger kind of regional kind of way. That makes sense.
uh, well, I mean, just wooden
But you're not
houses.
changing just the property. You're not just changing the property tax. You're changing a whole bunch of other, as in the list of 10, you're changing a whole bunch of other, things that you don't normally get taxed for or that other things should be taxed for, etc. It's just a friggin',
Oh, if you're
it's
doing other things.
yeah, yeah.
Well,
It's not just the one thing. No, I mean, otherwise you get trapped in the whole, you're in a merry-go-round. I mean,
yeah, because I can't.
that's the Prop 13 problem. oh, well, we're just paying too much property taxes and blah, blah, we got to lower this, and, the schools need to get rid of their art classes or, whatever.
Yeah, that was a dumb
That was just
solution.
horseshit. I mean,
Yeah.
whatever. It just, it's monumental stupidity. And speaking as a voter from California, every effing year you'd see this Prop 13 tax revolters. Oh God, just so
Oh, yeah.
stupid reactionaries.
Oh, well, we had that in our towns in Connecticut and Massachusetts, where there would be a fight over the school budget every year
Oh God.
because,
Oh,
you know,
how many kids? Why should I pay for it? Blah blah blah.
yeah. I mean, I am sympathetic to that. You know, if you've been living in a town your whole life and you've paid now, but property value,
Oh,
because
property values. Oh man, what an
what
ideology.
matters is your ability to pay.
Well, as I said, you have to take all 10 at once, and you know, but I don't think it's that bad. I just don't think you can do it like the Georgists or the neo-physiocrats want to do, and just say, well, we'll all base it on land, and then we're going to do this and that with it. And I go, it's not about creating a single tax. It is about thinking about the larger system of equity at work, and noting, of course, that we've had decades of people looting the system.
That, you know, if you were just going to increase the property taxes in an effort to arrest the house prices going up, that's not going to fly politically. People,
Oh no,
you'd be
no,
saying to people,
you'd have a revolt. You'd have more idiots running around with tea bags on their hats and
right?
stupid shit, stupid stuff.
Yes.
But I mean, that's kind of why I like paying for schools, because maybe people get smart and not put tea bags on their hats. But anyway,
I just think there's a more equitable way to do it than property tax.
yes. Oh no, but it's a whole, as Hudson sort of points out, you got to do all this stuff.
Yeah.
But but it wouldn't be inequitable. In other words, it equity would occur. I mean, rich people could still buy their Lamborghinis. It wouldn't. You know, I mean,
Oh,
and
thank
it is
God
made
for
at a
that.
smaller. Well, it is what they do at a smaller scale, right? In Scandinavian countries, right? The people who own Lamborghinis have to pay. If they get caught speeding, right? They pay huge penalties.
Yes, and that's a good idea.
I think it's a great idea.
Okay.
I mean, I live in a town where, in the summer, the rich people, drag their sports cars out of their damn garages, and so I'm seeing all kinds of really super vehicles running around my town, and I go, I wonder how much that cost.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna cut off the live stream if there aren't any more interventions and what's it? I think, or Joe.